This week, I'm veering between two extremes. As well as beginning to repair the ravages of winter in my dry garden, I shall also be adding moisture-loving plants to the damp garden. Carol is swapping tips with someone who's turned her garden into a wildlife haven.
Oh, this is great. It's like being a kid again, isn't it?
There he is.
And Rachel visits a beautiful Northamptonshire garden, full of design inspiration for gardens of any size. Hello, welcome to Gardener's World and to Longmeadow. And in the last 2 weeks, the garden has moved on. It's become another season. After the blistering heat and bone dryness of April, now we're in May, it's a bit cooler. We've had some rain and the garden has shifted. It's moved up a gear. And this piece of the garden has become dominated, quite frankly, by weeds. But I try and nourish at least some of my weeds because I think they're beautiful. The cow parsley, for example, is one of the loveliest plants on the whole of these islands. And the combination of cow parsley and the hawthorn blossom is, to my mind, as good as anything any gardener has ever devised. But there is goosegrass coming through, which is a bit of a thug. It's pretty, but I weed it out as I pass. And one of the things that I find most interesting about weeds is that they will always adapt to where they are. Doesn't matter if it's dry soil, damp soil, if it's a windy site, exposed, you will find weeds perfectly suited to that environment. And of course you can learn from that in deciding what you plant. And also there's a whole ecosystem, because they're such an important part of the biodiversity of the garden. They're a really good source of food for insects and mammals that depend upon those weeds. So they're interesting, they're useful, and at times a bloody nuisance. This is the damp garden. It leads off the spring garden. We haven't been in here yet, but it's one of those areas that floods. And what makes it damp, and the reason why we call it the damp garden, is it really gets drenched. Probably 2, 3, even 4 times a year. So the plants that we put in here are those that love a really long, good soak. Of course, one of the real disadvantages of flooding is that a whole mass of weed seeds come in. And in this part of the garden, the real danger are nettles. And so we've taken everything out and dug the nettle roots out. The good thing is it's created spaces, so I can do some more planting. And that's what I intend to do now. Now, one of the main sources of colour are ligularias. Now, I've got 3 ligularias here, which are self-seeded. This is Ligularia the rocket, but they're too close to the hedge, they're too close to the front. So I want to move those. And if I just get in there underneath, they come up fairly easily with quite a good root system. You can see I've got, in fact, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 plants in there. Actually, these stems aren't particularly dark, but they will get much darker to get to the point where they're absolutely black. And you have the black stems, the green leaves, and these yellow cones or spires of flower. Dramatic, lovely plant. It'll perform best in quite moist soil, certainly heavy soil, and in some shade too. It doesn't like sunshine all day. I'm not going to plant this immediately because of the ferns. These shuttlecock ferns love it in here, but they are thugs. And it's this idea of when a plant that you've deliberately put in place takes over, does it become a weed? And in the case of these, I think they are. I think they're a lovely, lovely weed. So I want to move some of these to make room for the ligularias. I'm going to move them further back because the point of the damp garden is to let it merge out into the countryside. So it becomes wilder and wilder, and then the weeds happily are allowed to dominate. I'm just going to pop that in the ground like that, and it's as easy as that. Now, let's get on with these ligularias. This is a mouthful to pronounce, but lovely to look at. Ligularia prozwolskii. It's got these cut leaves. The stems aren't so dark. It has fairly similar flowers to the rocket, yellow, tall spires, and it's a graceful, tall plant. And the third Ligularia I'm growing here is Desdemona. And Desdemona has these pinky purple stems and undersides to her leaves, green on top. And then the flowers are like great big egg yolk yellow daisies. A very dramatic, startling plant. I'll put a few in here. They're slightly less vigorous than the other two. Put one there. I've got those group there and there, so I think I'd like one up here.
Life could be a dream if I could take you up in paradise up above.
And because I want to create a lush, exuberant feel in this garden, hostas are an obvious choice. The first one is this, which is called Sum and Substance. And if you plant it in sun, it turns almost yellow. It's a very yellowy green, which of course picks up with the Ligularia theme and also the bright shining green of the ferns. Put it in full shade and it'll stay greener, but I like the yellow. And hostas will grow perfectly happily in sunshine if they've got enough moisture. They're not actually completely happy in full shade. Dapple shade is best. This is Sibbaldiana, which is another large hosta with a nice glaucous blue cover. It will grow and keep on growing for about 10 to 15 years, getting bigger and bigger, and the leaves get very cupped. Now obviously, the first question you get asked about with hostas is how do you defend them against the attacks of slugs or snails? You can put grit round them, that deters slugs and snails. If you're growing them in pots, as I did in London 20 years ago, we used to put copper around the pots or Vaseline. You're making life more difficult for a snail to get at. I've also tried, and with some success, using comfrey. We've got over here comfrey leaves. And if you just pick leaves like that and lay them around a hosta or any other plant that you're worried about, and I've used this on lettuce seedlings, the slugs and snails will eat the comfrey first. As it breaks down, it's much more attractive to your average slug than the hosta leaf. Now that will want feeding, and one of the issues with hostas is getting the balance of feed right, because they love nitrogen, especially in spring. But if you give them too much nitrogen, you get lush growth, and then the slugs and snails go for it. So either give them a balanced fertilizer, or, I always come back to this, good old garden compost, which is not too rich in nitrogen, but just releases its nutrients nice and slowly and in a balanced way. And I will mulch these nice and thickly with compost.
Life could be a dream, life could be a dream.
Now the reason why the soil here is so rich is because it's silt from flooding that's built up over thousands of years. And the reason why it floods is because it's dead flat. This garden is flat and it's surrounded by a floodplain. But Rachel has been to Coton Manor, which is built on a slope. And over the last 20 years, the garden has been planted and maintained and designed to make the very most of that particular feature.
Coton Manor is packed with inspirational planting, so I brought my camera.
Beyond a 17th century manor are 10 acres of fabulous gardens shelving away down the hill.
In fact, these slopes form a series of beguiling mini gardens.
Be it shaded or a sun trap, skillful planting makes the most of the conditions. Each separate part of the garden has a different feel. It's all the vision of Susie Pasley-Byler. 20 years ago, Susie was a hobby gardener. Then, when her husband inherited the family home, she found herself with an enormous garden to manage.
It took a couple of years and then I was completely hooked, and I've been learning ever since. I'm out here every minute I can be, really. I mean, anything that interferes with this is a sort of setback.
So you're not a fair weather gardener?
No, I'm out in all weathers.
You're on quite a steep slope. And how have you managed to deal with that?
People who have very flat gardens feel they've got to sort of create a structure. The slope sort of does it for us, so it makes it easier.
Yes.
Pushing a barrier uphill at the end of the day is hard work, but from every other point of view, it's absolutely fine.
Oh, this is quite a different feel.
It is. It's a different mood here altogether, isn't it?
This corner of the garden gets heavily shaded by a canopy of mature deciduous trees. It's the perfect place for plants that flower before the trees come into full leaf.
Just goes to show, doesn't it? Because people think of dry shade as a terrible problem in their garden, but look at this, it's absolutely heaving with plants.
At this time of year in spring, you can grow these things while they've still got the light coming through the trees. I particularly love the erythroniums. I think they're just so stunning, and they're only here for a really short time, and you just have to really enjoy them when they're here. This one, Pagoda, I think is the most lovely soft yellow. And then we've got Californicum White Beauty here, with its mottled leaves, which are really spectacular.
So you get a sort of double interest, don't you, once the flowers have faded? And of course there you've got an epimedium with equally lovely foliage, completely different.
Epimediums are wonderful. They flourish and thrive in dry shade, and they don't give us any trouble.
What are the tricks, do you think, that you use in order to keep this amount of flower going where you're under this dry shade?
We put a lot of leaf mould in every year. That does help because that's nice and moist when it goes in, so it helps retain the moisture that's already in the ground. And we just have to keep right on top of the weeding and the plants that want to invade the others and try and keep them at bay.
It seems to be working a treat. It is absolutely beautiful.
Well, thank you.
At Coton Manor, plants create the atmosphere in each area, and coherence comes from a restricted colour palette and carefully chosen leaf texture. Further down, Susie has taken advantage of the slope to create naturalistic planting around the stream.
We've come from dry shade, but in this area, you make use of the water to make a sort of damp, shaded areas?
It's a wonderful opportunity for all these plants, which at the moment show their contrasting foliage. Again, we've got the ferns, the metusias, masses of different euphorbias. This one is called Euphorbia palustris, which is stunning at this stage of the year.
Absolutely stunning. Do you have a particular favourite combination of plants in this area?
I think the plants we've got in front of us here are as good as they get in this area. We've got the marsh marigold with its yellow flowers, picking up the Euphorbia palustris, and the foliage of the Lizzie Keaton, the skunk cabbage, with the contrasting foliage of the Acer. And I think that does compose a lovely picture at the moment. It's, it's ephemeral, it's not going to last all summer like that.
So you've got this sort of rounded mounds of colour building up as you go up the slope. It's quite brilliant.
Everything I've seen at Coton Manor would work in a garden of any size.
Well, this is a particularly beautiful combination. You've got the Euphorbia, which is Griffithii Fireglow, and it really lives up to its name. And right next to it, the tulip Orange Emperor. The combination is sensational. But to make it even better, Susie's gone the extra mile and she's added that bright blue Himalayan poppy. The colour just pops. It really is very effective.
Coton Manor is open until the end of September, but if you can't get to Northamptonshire, there are lots of other outstanding gardens to visit now. Aberglasney Gardens in Carmarthenshire is fantastic for damp shade, as is Beth Chatto's garden near Colchester. And for a stunning woodland garden, you can't beat Castle Howard near York. For even more suggestions, go to our website.
I've got some emails here in response to our gardening dilemmas. And a number of them cover the same topic. I've got one here, and it's fairly representative of all of them, from Lorraine Fountain. And Lorraine, you say that your lovely bay tree, and you send a picture of it, there it is, has been hit by something that has browned the leaves, and you've got these black stains underneath. Well, you're not alone. I bet there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of you who've had bay trees turn to shriveled brown, and that's the cold. The good news is that it is amazing how they will regrow. So wait till you see active signs of new growth, then cut out all the dead, reshape it as need be. That's the tough bit. Give it a bit of TLC and it should come back. Now I've got a rosemary, also a Mediterranean plant, that has had exactly the same harsh response to a harsh winter. I've pulled out 6 in this garden in the last month or so, and actually I thought this one was going to be okay, but I don't think it's worth keeping. So I think this poor old boy had better go, and I'll plant another rosemary in its place. So first of all, I'll cut it back and then dig it out. If you've got a shrub like this rosemary, the growth, the new growth, is all at the ends, and it will never make an attractive, well-foliaged shrub. It'll always be straggly and struggling. By the way, we keep any rosemary we cut and put it on the sitting room fire because it burns really well and smells delicious. There's something about rosemary stems when you hold it. They feel particularly dry and scaly. It's got all that parched quality of a Mediterranean hillside. In fact, there are 2 bushes in here. There we go. I don't know if you can hear, but I am on solid rock there. And actually, because of that, I'm going to add some horticultural grit, because there's nothing that rosemary hates more than its roots sitting in wet, particularly in winter when it's cold. So that goes in like that, and it doesn't matter 2 hoots that it's going to be poor soil. Rosemary's tough when it comes to conditions. Now I've got a plant here that I've had in the pot all winter. Pretty pot bound. And what I like to do if things are pot bound is just loosen it slightly. You damage some roots, and I don't want to break them open completely, but just tease them a little bit, and they will respond as though they've been pruned and grow out. Okay, that can go in. I think that'll be fine. Fundamentally, rosemary will be at home in these conditions, and that is the secret of happy plants, and therefore a good garden, which is to go with nature. Now, Carol has been to visit a garden which started just going with nature like this, but actually, as it went along, has taken things much further.
Sue Cam loves gardening, but for her, it's not just for the plants. It's for the wildlife those plants attract.
See so many different bird feeders. Aren't they wonderful?
They're all for different birds. That one's for the robins and the sparrows.
Right.
These are for the tits and the finches.
So they've got their own special
Yes.
restaurant, haven't
yes.
they? Yeah.
There's one to suit every bird that comes into the garden.
What's this?
It's the dog hair. I collected it up in a carrier bag and in the spring put it in there for the birds for nesting material.
Right, so it must be very popular
Yes.
right now.
I can fill that up a couple of times in the day.
Cool. I mean, this is a much more traditional sort of bird table, isn't it?
Not only the birds use that one, the little voles come to that one too. Which is probably why we get through about 6 kilos of bird food a week.
What?
I think they eat better than us.
Now, wildlife, being wild, is quite shy, and my visit's a bit of a disturbance. So we organised a specialist wildlife cameraman to stake out Sue's garden and film the creatures that visit in a single typical day.
Oh, chaffinch.
You can hear them already all around the garden, can't you?
Oh, here's your
the
woodpecker.
Oh. He's hitting again.
That's the great spotted woodpecker, and that's a female. She's got.
How'd you tell?
She's got no red on the back of her neck. The male has a red stripe on the back of his neck.
I mean, you must get masses of other creatures in here.
We've got newts in the pond, frogs and toads and grass snakes.
Ooh.
Buzzards, we see a lot of those. There's a pair of them which nest not far from here.
Did you originally imagine that it was going to be a wildlife garden? Is that...
No, not at all. Not even. It didn't even cross my mind. It was just a case of dig beds, put flowers in, and gradually they arrived. And the more wildlife arrived, the more interesting I found them, and the more I tried to encourage more to come.
Well, they're fascinating pictures, but I want to see the real thing. Can we go and explore?
Yeah, come and see what I grow. This is my favourite part of the garden. I've always loved the woodlands around here with all the bluebells and the wildflowers, and I wanted one of my own.
Very beautiful it is too. Amazing what you can do in such a small space, really, isn't it? An important part of Sue's success in attracting wildlife comes from creating different habitats. What's this contraption?
Oh, this is for the toads.
Toad Hall, is it?
The bottom of it is filled with wet sand.
Right.
And I found that when I've been doing building work, I find toads hibernating in my building sand. Right. So I filled this with wet sand, and that's where the toads are.
Is he in there then?
I don't know. It's probably warm enough for him to have woken up now and
he's
gone finding food.
Yeah, he's out eating all your slugs.
Excellent.
Yeah, with a
yes.
bit of luck. Ponds attract masses of wildlife, and I want to see what Sue's got in hers. Oh, this is great. It's like being a kid again, isn't it? I didn't go out with a goldfish bowl though.
Oh, huge.
What can you see? Just have a...
There he is.
Look at that. Oh, it's beautiful! How brilliant.
He's a great diving beetle.
How wonderful.
It's one of the biggest predators in the pond.
Having water in your garden, however big or small it is, it's the sort of hub, isn't it? It's the centre for wildlife.
It's fantastic for everything. There's so many insects use it, so it's good for the birds, it's good for the bats, it's good for frogs, it's good for snakes, it's good for toads. It's good for everything.
In Sue's garden, the door's always open for wildlife. And whilst I'm here, she's keen to find out how to attract even more. It's looking a mite sparse around the edges.
Last year I relined it, so it needs more plants, but I'm not sure what to plant in here that's not going to be incredibly invasive, but is good for the wildlife.
You could think about bog bean, lovely native plant, Manyanthus trifoliata, because it's got 3 leaves, trifoliata, and it's got such pretty little flowers, so that will also attract insects.
Does that float?
Yes.
It's a floating plant.
It's a half and half. You can plant it as a marginal and it'll spread its leaves out beautifully, but it's not invasive. And then you could think about introducing more things that have got straight leaves, you know, for all those dragonflies to climb up. I mean, you've already got lovely irises, that gorgeous carex, but how about Butomus? Do you know that?
No,
it's
that
called
doesn't.
Butomus umbellatus. It's flowering rush. It's got pretty pink flowers, but it still does the job of all these other things because it's got straight linear leaves. So it will act as a, you know, wonderful resource for those dragonflies.
I certainly share Sue's pleasure that she gets from her birds. This garden is full of birds, and look, I've just noticed this actually. It is last year's nest. In here, I didn't see it at all last year. Prune this back. This is a thrush or a blackbird. If it was this year's, of course, there'd be young in it and I wouldn't disturb it. But because we have so many hedges and we allow them to grow, it's full of birds, particularly songbirds, which is a delight. And it's very good for the garden too, because they eat our slugs and snails, they eat the insects. They add to that sustainable balance, which is what we're trying to get in a healthy garden. And if you want to encourage birds, as well as feeding them, as good a way as any is to have lots of hedges. We don't cut our hedges at all between the beginning of March and August, so that gives them time to nest and rear young without disturbing them. And also the other great secret for attracting birds is don't be too tidy. Leave some leaves, leave dead wood, leave piles of bits and pieces, and the birds will love it. Although I won't be cutting my hedges, there are plenty of other things to be getting on with this weekend. Now that they've finished flowering, this is the best time to prune early flowering clematis. You can cut back as hard as you like, as long as you get on and do it now. I'm cutting this Clematis macropetala right back to the ground, because it's become an unruly tangle and I want the new growth to be trained in as it grows. Next year, it'll be full of flower again. The lily beetle is spreading fast across the country, causing havoc in its wake as it feasts on the leaves of all plants in the lily family. However, it is bright red, so very easy to spot. If you move gently, you can catch it before it falls to the ground and then destroy it in whatever way you feel fit. Even though we've had such a hot past month, we could still get some frost yet. So it's worth earthing up your potatoes now. Pull the soil up the ridges to cover the foliage. This won't only protect them from the cold, but also cover any tubers that are appearing and stop them going green, and providing an extra layer of protection against possible blight spores later in the summer. Everything has been tremendously early this spring, even in this garden, which normally lags behind most. These alliums, for example, are a good 2 or 3 weeks ahead of normal, but they're fantastic. And what I love about seeing plants as they come back every year is you greet them as old friends, but they always exceed memory and expectation. They're always better than you possibly could imagine. And that's one of the great joys of gardening. Now, next week, I'll be seeing old friends as myself, Carol, Rachel and Joe are all visiting the Malvern Show. And that will be on at 8 o'clock, half an hour earlier than our normal time. And I suspect to see a lot of plants, because it's such an early season, that I wouldn't normally get at Malvern. Maybe plants that you would expect to see at Chelsea. Anyway, I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you'll join us all then. Until then, bye-bye.